Now, when it comes to the word globalization, certainly that we need to bring one critical country into our conversation, which is China. And given the fact today that China is on this unstoppable path, politically speaking and also economically speaking, looking around post the pandemic, that everyone is asking the question, what is the future for China? Or even better yet, how should we understand the current deadlock between China and the United States of America? But meanwhile, if we pay closer attention, we also need to understand this ongoing relationship between China and some countries in Africa, even put this bigger picture, how about the continent of Africa? And we know that China has been generating much greater noises in terms of investing into the nations in Africa and also building, again, economic centers and, political interest among the countries in Africa as well. And what about the reaction in return? How much do we understand the mutual benefits and also the mutual political interests between China and some countries in Africa? How about the future? Well, in this episode, we're going to answer all the questions by speaking to one of the distinguished scholars, which is Dr. Joshua Eisenman. Again, Dr. Eisenman is Associate Professor of Politics. His expertise covers international political economy, comparative politics, Chinese politics, U.S.-China relations. Of course, if you follow his work, his latest book, which is called China's Relations with Africa. Well, Dr. Eisenman, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
It's great to be here, Will. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, again, Dr. Eisenman, as we mentioned before, when we look at the word globalization, and too often we tend to focus on this current deadlock between U.S. and China, but before we go there, based on your book, again, touch on this meaningful and also critical relationship between China and also the countries in Africa. So my first question is, why is it essential and also significant for us to understand the relationship between China and some countries in Africa under the current Chinese leader? What do you say to that?
Well, it's important to understand China's relations with Africa for a variety of reasons. First, China's relations with Africa are prioritized by China more than academics would presume they would be. China has made Africa what it calls the cornerstone or a cornerstone of its foreign policy. This actually began under Hu Jintao, who made these remarks in South Africa, but have continued under Xi Jinping. And although the relations China has, of course, bilateral relations with nearly every country in Africa except for one, Eswatini. They've evolved. This idea of Africa as an essential component of Chinese foreign policy has remained, and it's signified by the fact that each year for over 20 years, the Chinese foreign minister's first visit every year is to Africa or an African country. And so that has been a kind of not so subtle signal that China prioritizes Africa. And it does so for a variety of reasons, some of which are ideological in terms of China suggesting it is the leader of the global South, the leader of the developing world. This is something that goes back to the Mao era. But it's also diplomatic in terms of African countries are a large voting bloc at the United Nations. They helped China to secure its position in the United Nations in 1970. China is fond of referencing these historical friendships, which would be a third reason, the historical relationships that China has on the continent, and that these things are constantly referenced by both sides to suggest that the relations are important and that they are kind of a bellwether of China's relations with the world. And so for what it's worth, I've noticed, and I think this has been growing over time, that the views of African diplomats, as well as other countries in the global South, but we're talking about Africa in particular, can often have more weight than those of the United States, Japan, the EU, etc. Right? So China gives, for the reasons I said, and then I'm sure we could talk about others in terms of the U.S.-China rivalry, etc. as we go on in our discussion, gives a lot of weight to Africa, or more weight, as I said at the beginning, than we would suspect that it would give If you're just thinking of the world as a kind of IR theorist paradigm of global players, and so what's the importance of these small, insignificant, at least insignificant in terms of security, right? China's security is not dependent on any African player, right? So why does China spend so much attention? And that's one thing we get into in the book a lot, right? This discussion of why is Africa important to China, both politically and in terms of security.
Again, Dr. Eisenman, as we mentioned before, and also this is something that everyone knows, that this year marks the significance of the Belt and Road Initiative. And again, of course, under the current Chinese leader, One Belt and One Road Initiative is one of the major global projects. Again, it constitutes more than 100 countries. And previously, that even before the pandemic, we've seen a lot more countries in Africa actively participated and also joined this Belt and Road Initiative. Now, help us with better understanding. How does the Belt and Road Initiative actually create impact under the current leader of China and spread throughout the continent of Africa? So in other words, why do more and more countries in Africa are very much interested in participating or becoming a member of the Belt and Road Initiative? Is it more than infrastructure built? Is it more than economic partnership? What is it? What is the motivation for that?
The Belt and Road Initiative and its relationship with Africa is actually quite complicated because China had been engaging in projects that are Belt and Road type projects, which is a kind of, when I think of the Belt and Road, it's primarily a kind of a debt-driven financing strategy. And China had been engaged in that in Angola and Ethiopia and other places before the Belt and Road was initiated. And then these things were kind of rolled into the Belt and Road later on, in part because when the initial maps came out showing us what the Belt and Road was, right? There were some initial maps, and now it's questionable if Belt and Road has, I think, outgrown those maps in many ways. But the initial maps did not include Africa, or they only included Kenya. And so there was a bit of pushback from Africans who said, well, wait a minute, we are strategically important. You tell us why aren't we part of the Belt and Road in a more robust fashion? I think they, to some degree, felt both that they had been the kind of precursor in terms of the thought development behind it, but then ultimately were not included in the initial design of it for whatever reason. And I'm not privy to the initial discussions on Belt and Road to the point where I'm going to get into that. But there was then some discussion, I believe, about how to include African countries in the Belt and Road. And then since that time, we've seen the African countries become a more robust part of the Belt and Road. But again, like other Belt and Road questions, it's unsure sometimes whether or not that was a kind of pre-existing project that was rolled into the larger scheme or that was initiated by the Belt and Road. These things can sometimes be unclear. But what is clear is that in terms of the politics of Belt and Road and the diplomacy of Belt and Road, the African countries have signed up and participated. Now, Belt and Road has evolved, as all policies evolve over time, and has changed. So the initial thrust of, as I said, debt-driven development has evolved into, I would say, more political security type of engagements. And I would say that other concepts, such as the Community of Shared Future for Mankind, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, these things have not subsumed the Belt and Road, but they've advanced this kind of China in the global South, China in the world, China's increasing engagement, increasing influence, and they've kind of moved that concept forward, that kind of broader concept that Belt and Road fostered. Now, the problem with the initial concept of Belt and Road was that and actually, Ambassador Shin and I did interviews in Beijing in 2017, and we heard this from a variety of people, was that there was a concern about whether or not some of these projects were viable. And there was a dispute at that time, a discussion about how much China could afford to take on unproductive projects and how and what that would mean for China's balance sheet. And Some people thought this was not a big deal, that China had, China's economy was big and this was fundamentally not all that much money. Others felt that it would be bad for China to hold all of this debt from around the world and have to manage all of those difficult questions. There was real varying views at that time. And what happened, and I think largely due to the effects of COVID-19, right, forced a contraction in the global economy, made a lot of these loans, which may have at one point appeared viable. Nobody could predict COVID, and so the global economy receded, and it meant that a lot of countries, from Sri Lanka to Zambia, etc., had a problem repaying their Belt and Road debt. And so China and these countries and the global institutions, I stress not the United States, because the United States has not lent. It has worked primarily in grants. So it's mainly Euro bondholders, IMF, etc., and other lenders who bought bonds. They're working together right now, and I'm not very privy to all of the detail of this, to try to come up with ways to alleviate the problem, because we don't want a bunch of Sri Lankas that we just saw with the debt defaults and everything. It's not good for anybody. So right now, China, I think finds itself in a difficult position because it doesn't want to give up leadership in the global South. It doesn't want to see these projects. It wants to have a healthy economic relationship where these loans are paid back and more can be made later. It doesn't want to throw good money after bad, right? And that makes sense. But it's also politically difficult in these fraught times, with the Ukraine war, etc., to have to manage all of this. And so the Belt and Road Initiative, has evolved over time, but it is also, in many ways, given China some headaches that it's now trying to kind of work through. And so there is, I think, an understanding that the kinds of financing, the levels of financing that had gone out are not going to go out, or have not been going out. And now at this point, China is in the kind of managing the current state. Now, that doesn't preclude China from making additional loans. I just think it's going to be more conservative about those loans than it might have been in the past, given what we saw with the COVID and the Ukraine and the unpredictability of the world at this moment, given tensions in the Taiwan Strait, etc. It may be more reluctant to lend out large amounts of money.
Professor Eisenman, again, one thing that's quite unique, because we know that when we come to economic agenda, as we mentioned before, some countries initially, when they joined Belt and Road Initiative, it's really, I guess, the word called reciprocity. So in other words, they're hoping that by participating or by becoming a member, they're able to receive the benefits. But meanwhile, we know that China lends a chunks of money to those countries. But instead of paying them China back, which almost impossible, don't you think that really put those countries in a vulnerable position? So that will basically put China at more advantages. What do you say to that, to those countries that who can't really compensate for their effort, by paying China back, but meanwhile they have to, I want to be careful, give up something so valuable in order to keep China happy or keep the Chinese economy sustainable? What do you say to that?
Okay, so I think that and China treats each one of these countries on a case-by-case basis. So it deals with them individually. And its frustration right now is that if it gives to one country, then it may be forced into giving to others, and that may lead to a kind of a cycle, which then leads to, what we call a moral hazard problem, right? People don't think they have to pay back the money, and then this becomes problematic. Now, what you're talking about has been called like the debt trap narrative.
Right.
That China had kind of intentionally gone in and loaded these countries up with debt, and then is like, ha, 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 they didn't pay us back. Now we've got them over the barrel. Now we can get, Now, I was always skeptical of that narrative. It was, to me, always a caricature because, as I said a moment ago, I think China wanted both. It wanted to have the political savviness to go into countries that weren't able to get financing from those Westerners who were discriminating against global South countries and perhaps even racist in their own right in terms of giving to people with darker complexions, right? And China was going to meet that need, and so do the right thing politically, but also do the right thing economically in terms of invest in projects that would get yield returns and get paid back, right? But as we all know, it's easier to lend money than to recoup it.
That's
and
right.
And so what ultimately happened is that China, I think, finds itself in a difficult position because it got that initial political bump by making the lending. Everybody showed up for the Belt and Road conferences and everything and was happy to take the loans. But when between, some projects not working out, contingency, COVID, Ukraine, etc., they can't pay back. Now it becomes a political liability as well as an economic liability. And I can tell you there were people in Beijing who knew this, right, who told this to investors and I at the time during our interviews, who expressed their deep concerns, right? This is people in the U.S. Chinese government, people who worked in these circles. And they expressed their concerns. But ultimately, this is written into the Chinese constitution. It is Xi Jinping's premier policy. So it was going to happen politically. And it did happen. And now, for a variety of reasons that we've already gone over, it hasn't worked out well. And so now, kind of in the light of history, we can say they were debt trapped. But at the time, I don't think that was the intention. I don't think they wanted these countries to not pay back. I think they wanted them. And I still think they want them to pay money back. Like, I think if China had a choice between A, keeping them on the hook with large debts, not getting service payments, or B, having loan service, I think they would choose B every day.
Of course. That's understandable. Yeah.
Which is not a debt trap, right? The debt trap would suggest that you're in the trap and unable to get yourself out. Right. It wants these countries to get out. It doesn't want to. And so I think there is some frustration when, say, a Pakistan comes back in with its hand back out and you're throwing good money after bad, but politically you feel constrained because you have a friendship as high as the Himalayas and you have to deal with that. Right.
Well, Dr. Eisenman, I want to move on to the next part of the conversation. When we talk about propaganda, of course, we know that propaganda works. We've seen the effectiveness historically, and also, of course, in your book, that you also talk about the comprehension of propaganda. We talk about media propaganda, political propaganda. Now, when it comes to the purpose of propaganda, especially from the Chinese perspective, it's, I guess, most of us would say that to rejuvenate the country. So in other words, we look at the model, and then we've seen the promising speeches from the leaders. We've seen how the media play out the roles. Now, the next question is, are the African nations actually learning and understanding those propagandas from the Chinese perspective? So in other words, do you think that how much do the Chinese propaganda actually impact the growth and also the political or social change among the countries in Africa? What do you say to that?
So the concept of propaganda in China should be understood first and foremost as not a dirty word, not a bad word, right? The term trend is not necessarily, quote, bad, as we might think of it in English. The word propaganda is considered, has a negative connotation. It doesn't necessarily in Chinese. And so you have propaganda, I think, perceived of primarily as just one of many tools of policy making that China's policymakers can use in order to achieve their objectives. And in fact, when China talks of its, quote, soft power, propaganda is one of the tools in the toolbox of soft power, in a way that you wouldn't necessarily consider it to be primarily from like a liberal democratic country, which invests very little in external propaganda, if anything, right? So it's important to understand there's a different perception. And then it's important to also understand that Chairman Xi Jinping has been very clear in his instructions to, quote, tell a good Chinese story. So he is instructed, and he's gone to the propaganda organs. He's visited them, and he's spoken to their leadership and their staff directly and explained to them the importance that they serve in helping China to tell its Chinese story. Right? He's done this. And so he's added that political impetus to it. So it's not a kind of second tier thing. It's part of an important part of China's foreign policy, according to President Xi. Right. So and then to understand that the propaganda then has many different components to it. Right. So we tend to think of propaganda in terms of media propaganda. Okay. This is our big we think of propaganda. We think of the China Daily. We think of the People's Daily. We think of CGTN. We think of the kind of main organs of Chinese propaganda. However, Chinese propaganda, and we go in the book also into, we talk about media propaganda, of course, but we also go into educational propaganda and cultural propaganda. And so these are, I would say, the three main components of China's Africa-focused propaganda work. Educational propaganda can be anything from short-term training programs to even degree granting programs, scholarships, etc. And we've seen, for the numbers we have, which stop in 2018, we see a ski slope in terms of African participation, in terms of percentages, in terms of raw numbers, until 2018, when the numbers stop. And I have no doubt that they included 2019 as well. After that, COVID takes its hand, and we don't know. It went down. I mean, everything went down. Excuse me. But then you also have, sports propaganda. You have women's groups. You have a linguistic language learning contest. You have healthcare. You have within, these Chinese cultural centers as well. You have the Confucian institutes. And so you've got a whole kind of litany of different elements of China's propaganda. And during the COVID-19, we saw healthcare propaganda in terms of the COVID-19 vaccines and masks, etc., being delivered. And so propaganda has numerous, almost unlimited elements that you can include. There's even been Muslim to Muslim propaganda in terms of different groups. The important unifying thing is, though, these things are run by the party. They're under the leadership of the party. They are political in nature. And they have an intent, and that intent is to improve the image of China and to increase collaboration and improve China's influence in the country, or increase it. Increasingly, however, there's also been, in an effort to tell a good Chinese story, also an effort to juxtapose that with liberal democracy and say, in fact, China has a special sauce that, in terms of governance, that's better than liberal democracy. And this is an evolution, because during the Hu Jintao era, in our first book, Ambassador Shin and I were very clear that we did not think that China was intentionally, aggressively coming after the United States. That book was published in 2012. In the new book, however, we find ample evidence that China is now, in part of its propaganda effort, is an anti-U.S. or anti-Western or anti-liberal democracy campaign that says, not that China's system is just as good, but no, China has something that's better than the other, right? Personally, from a strategic perspective, I think this is, I see this as a strategic negative. My personal view is that it locks China into an anti-U.S. campaign that is not always going to be helping China in a geostrategic sense. So when you ask yourself, will there be U.S.-China rapprochement, and you look at all the anti-U.S. sentiment being pushed out in China's propaganda outlets in Africa and other global South areas, you think it'd be very difficult, because you'd have to change the propaganda line. So this evolution in the propaganda line in many ways has locked China into a more hardline anti-U.S. position than might be ideal for China under the circumstances. Now, I'm not going to tell China what's ideal for China. We'll leave that to the leaders of China, who probably know better than me what's best for their country. I'm not trying to tell them that. But what I am saying is, at this point, being as clearly anti-liberal democracy as the current line is, means that they would necessarily need to walk that back somewhat, as they did, by the way, in the 70s, right? China walked back its anti-U.S. line and increased its anti-Soviet line. We saw this occur, right? It's not impossible, but we do have historical precedent. But the point is, it makes it that an evolutionary change would have to occur, whereas in the previous iteration, before it was distinctly anti-U.S., China had the flexibility. You know what I mean? It could put out an anti-U.S. story and then not, right? But now it's very clear, and that I think is something they're going to have to deal with one way or the other.
Well, Professor, I want to move on to our conversation. Again, the news just broke out that current Secretary of the State Tony Blinken is scheduled to visit China, if everything goes well, very soon. Again, I think it'll be in 2 to 3 days. Now, when we talk about the current deadlock between China and the US, of course, that directly can influence the relationship between China and African countries as well. So my next question to you is, how do you think how do you think the role of US and China when we look at the African continent? Are those two countries actually competing with each other, or those two countries are actually seeking partnership when we talk about helping with the current political instability among the countries in Africa, or economic uncertainty for some countries in Africa? So what is the role of the two countries? Is it partnership? Is it competitors? Or, hey, listen, those two countries are running two completely separate errands. What do you say to that, Professor?
So, there has long been a lot of discussion about U.S.-China cooperation in Africa. But it's never really materialized in a serious way. I mean, there's been, how many grants were probably given out for different people to have conferences about this? And ultimately, the fact that the U.S.-China relationship has soured means that even if there may have been some minor opportunities, they fell victim to the larger trends in the relationship, which were, bigger, that they were swamped, if you will, right? By the wave of negativity in the bilateral relationship. Now, I am happy to hear that Blinken will go to China. I think that's a good thing. I hope I'm going to China too soon as well. So I think that what is really unfortunate, and I'll just say broadly, is that as a young student, I was able to study in China. And during that time, I was able to fall in love with China. I fell in love with all different aspects of China in the late 90s, 2000s. And there was something special, and there is something special about the country. And what's unfortunate is now we've got only a few hundred American students who are able to have that experience that I had, and very few Africans as well. So I think it's so important that the people-to-people and the educational relations remain, right? Which is why I want to go to China to teach and work with, professors there as well, because I believe that that's a really essential part of the relationship. And I think it's important for, China's relations with Africa as well. So that being said, African countries can benefit from the rivalry, or they can suffer from it. And I think that this is a case-by-case basis. And you can find different instances where countries have taken advantage of strategic competition between superpowers, certainly during the Cold War, but also certainly cases where they suffered. Right now, for instance, if you look, there's a controversy going on right now. It hasn't gotten any headlines in the U.S., but in South Africa, it's all the news, right? Which is the BRICS summit, supposed to be held in South Africa, but there is an arrest warrant for Putin for the heinous crimes of abducting Ukrainian children. Okay, and I mean, what could be worse, right? I mean, I guess a lot could be worse, but right. So this is mass kidnappings of children, right? And God knows what else. And so he's got a ICC warrant, and the South Africa is part of the ICC, the International Criminal Court. China is not, right? And so there's a discussion right now about whether or not to move the BRICS summit from South Africa to China. And there's a lot of South Africans who want to hold the summit and not hand over Putin, right? This has become a thing. And so this is just one instance, right, where you can see a country, now the biggest country in Africa, right? Arguably, Nigeria. We can have a debate, but South Africa, one of the biggest, most important hub countries in all of Africa, is now caught diplomatically between the West, which wants Putin handed over for his crimes, and China, and of course Russia, right? And so you can see here how this tension, puts this smaller country, although a bigger African country, in a tough spot. And it's controversial about what they'll do. And this is just one instance, right, where the struggle and the tension between the two can lead to the problems in these countries. However, from an economic perspective, I don't see any rivalry much to speak of at all. China can import raw materials from Africa, produce finished goods, and export them around the world along the global supply chains. I mean, helping their, and as long as there's demand, people will buy them, right? So you import, so I don't see economic tension. Really, the U.S. is not a serious lender like China has been for infrastructure. The U.S. does not have many firms active in certain spaces that Chinese firms are in. And so I don't see the economic competition as much. But you do see, as I mentioned with the South Africa example, the kind of geopolitical tension. But then you look at a place like Sudan, and China does not seem very involved in solving that problem. That's right. But the U.S. is, right? So in this case, China would also benefit if the U.S. were to be successful, and others, right, in negotiating a peaceful resolution to what's going on in Sudan, of which I'm no expert, but and China would benefit from that, right, if the U.S. were successful, right, because China has investments in both South and North Sudan and wants to continue to do business. And so each instance, as I said from the beginning, it's a case-by-case basis, and we need to kind of evaluate whether or not these interests are collaborative or whether or not they're conflictual, almost based on the kind of specific on-the-ground questions. So in South Africa, you have conflict, and in Sudan, you have possible cooperative instincts. Whether or not that actually happens, ultimately the people in Sudan and South Africa are going to make their decisions. They have agency in their own countries, and so they're not going to be. I mean, they may be influenced, but the decisions will be taken by these respective local actors.
That's right, Professor. Again, we know that China has been well known for not meddling with any international affairs because, again, and the same principle that China hopes other countries will understand and also obey as well. Now, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, we know when we talk about the economic growth and also we talk about this political ambition for China today, another organization or another what we call the powerhouse, which is the G7. Now, again, not too long ago, the G7, the 7 largest countries and powers got together, the leaders, they tried to design another program to counter China's political and also this economic growth. Now, Professor, again, from your perspective, briefly, how should we understand the plan under G7 when they talk about to balance the economic agenda and also expect China to play by the rules or follow the regulations? And also they're trying to come up with better plans to counter China's influence. How much do we understand that? And also how effective do you think that could be if the plan were to roll out?
I haven't seen a specific plan. I mean, I've seen statements made, and there's no doubt that the G7 is concerned, right, about what it calls, China's coercive economic influence and diplomacy, and has voiced that concern. It has also voiced the concern about China's continuing support for Russia and Ukraine. And in the G7 summit that just happened in Tokyo, Volodymyr Zelensky was there, along with the leaders of at least half a dozen countries, Indonesia, et cetera, right? We're all there, right? And so I think that and again, this is tough, right? But to me, if it is a sure sign that China is increasingly isolated among the leaders, the global leaders, right? Whereas in the global South, China may still be welcome in many quarters, that the strategy that has been undertaken has had costs. And I think that there's a lot of broad-based disappointment, right? like almost like straight sadness because there's a lot of people, and I count myself among them, who invested quite a lot in working with China and understanding China and sending our students to China. And to some degree, we're just really, we feel that, China didn't have to choose a conflictual path, right? That there was another way that could have occurred, right? That when we look at the tensions in the South China Sea, and we look at the tensions in the Taiwan Strait, and we look at, the camps in Xinjiang, and we look at what happened in Hong Kong, you wonder if China had taken different choices, because a lot of that has really scared the hell out of the West, right? And these police stations and the Huawei stuff, and it has been a real, the spy balloon, right? I mean, to some degree, if China hadn't, it wouldn't have had to, play ball, but it was a bit ham-fisted, is my point, right? China Development 2025, right? There was just a lot of these things going on that we're feeding into an anti-China narrative that gave a lot of oxygen to people who had been waiting to suggest that China was a threat, right? And so, I think that this is a kind of a broader feeling, and increasingly in Europe as well, of why did it, have to go this way? But it did, and here is where we are, right? And so I think that there's a kind of a reluctance, but a kind of acceptance now, a broader acceptance that China, especially in places like Canada, for instance, where there's been a variety of scandals going on with, where there had been a kind of a mollifying effect that they may have had on U.S. policy, where they may have said, to the U.S., don't be so. Now those countries in many ways are driving the U.S. to become more assertive. Now, China may misunderstand this. China may, and I've heard the statements, believe that the U.S. is dragging Vietnam into concerns about China. I can assure you it's very much the opposite in many cases, where smaller countries, Australia, South Korea, Vietnam, Canada, Lithuania, right, et cetera, smaller countries in the Western orbit have come to the United States and raised levels of concern. And I think the clearest concern that we've seen, and the clearest indication of this spookness, right, beyond like the Pew data, which is just shocking in terms of views of China collapsing,
right, has
been the South Korea, Japan rapprochement that's going on right now, right? I mean, given the history there of World War II, of comfort women, of all this terrible stuff, of colonialism, okay, within the lifetime of many people, not many, but some Koreans, the fact that we now see a rapprochement is concerning in Beijing, right? And so I think this is an indication that it's not just the G7, that there's a larger trend going on, and that China would do well, in my opinion, to recognize that and make a course correction in its foreign policy. Now, they have other plans, perhaps, and I'm not telling China what to do. But going to your initial question, it's not just a G7 v. China. I think that would, just like US v. China now is a kind of a mischaracterization to some degree, because in many ways China is very lonely now. It's a lonely power, right? And that's what Richard Nixon talked about many years ago, about that we don't want China lonely and isolated and like chewing on its discontents, right? We want to bring China into the global community of nations, right? And it's not too late for that, okay? But that decision is one that must be taken in Beijing, right? If China chooses China's path. China's not a weak country. China is a powerful nation, second biggest in the world. Whatever is done is the majority of the decision is going to be taken in Beijing. If China decides to attack and go across that Taiwan Strait, I assure you, Taipei is not attacking mainland China, right? We know, maybe it would have in the past. The reality of the situation is that the timing of that conflict, it will be wholly taken in Beijing. If a conflict breaks out, it will be because the Chinese side decided to initiate that conflict. I think we can agree, right? The Japanese are not attacking, right? There's no scenario where the Malaysians or anybody or the US is attacking China. So in this way, China is the master of its own fate. It has the power that it didn't during the century of humiliation. And this is something that's very important. And that's why so many countries in the G7 are pleading with China to make those decisions in a way that keeps peace and prosperity at the forefront.
Well, again, Dr. Eisenman, I agree with you. I mean, as you mentioned before, it's not too late to repair this broken relationship. And of course, at this moment, as we mentioned before, if the current Secretary of the State Tony Blinken successfully makes his trip to China, and again, for everyone's benefit, for every single country's benefit, we like to see the reconciliation, at least this handshake between the two countries. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Joshua Eisenman. And again, Dr. Eisenman is the Associate Professor of Politics, and his expertise covers international political economy, Chinese politics, U.S.-China relations, and I strongly encourage everyone go online to look for his latest book, which is entitled China's Relations with Africa. Well, Professor, thank you so much for taking your time to join the show. It's been a pleasure, and we love to keep in touch with you and have you back on the show as we continue to monitor and also follow the progress of those international affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.